The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud of foreboding, as General George Washington stood at his headquarters, peering through his spyglass at the forest of British masts crowding New York Harbor. It was August 21st, 1776, and the largest expeditionary force in British history had assembled to crush the American rebellion once and for all. 400 ships stretched across the water, their hulls black against the dawn sky, carrying 32,000 of King George III's finest soldiers and 8,000 Hessian mercenaries. Washington's weathered hands gripped the brass instrument tighter as he counted the enemy vessels. Never before had such a massive armada been deployed against colonial forces. The sight would have broken lesser men, but the Virginia planter turned revolutionary commander had steel in his spine forged by years of frontier warfare and political struggle. Behind him, his aide-de-camp Alexander Hamilton shuffled through dispatches, each one bringing grimmer news of British preparations. "Sir," Hamilton's voice cut through the morning stillness. "General Nathanael Greene reports that Admiral Richard Howe's fleet continues to disembark troops at Gravesend Bay. Our scouts estimate at least 15,000 redcoats have already cheered in." The strategic importance of New York could not be overstated. Control of the Hudson River would effectively cut New England off from the southern colonies, strangling the rebellion in its infancy. Washington understood that losing this position might well mean losing the war. Before it had truly begun, the Continental Congress had made their expectations clear. Hold New York at all costs. General William Howe, brother to the admiral and commander of British land forces, had chosen his landing site with surgical precision. Gravesend Bay on the southwestern shore of Long Island offered perfect conditions for a massive amphibious assault. The beaches were wide and gently sloped, ideal for landing artillery and supplies. More importantly, the position gave Howe multiple options for advancing on the American defensive positions centered around Brooklyn Heights. Washington's own forces numbered barely 8,000 men, a motley collection of Continental regulars and militia units from across the colonies. Many had never seen combat, their uniforms a patchwork of brown homespun and hunting shirts. Yet what they lacked in experience and equipment, they possessed in determination. These were men who had left their farms and shops to fight for an idea that free men should govern themselves. The American defensive strategy centered on a series of fortifications atop Brooklyn Heights. Overlooking the East River, these earthworks, hastily constructed over the previous weeks, commanded the approaches to Brooklyn and protected the vital ferry crossing to Manhattan. However, the position had a fatal flaw that would soon become apparent. It could be flanked from the east through the heights of Guam, where the Gowanus Road, Bedford Road, and Flatbush Road all converged. As referenced in David McCullough's detailed account in 1776, Washington divided his forces among his most trusted commanders. General Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran of the French and Indian War, would command the overall defense of Long Island. General John Sullivan would hold the American left flank along the Gowanus Road, while General William Alexander, who styled himself Lord Sterling, would anchor the right near the Gowanus Creek. The morning of August 22nd brought the first serious British probes, advanced units of light infantry, their green uniforms barely visible among the trees, began testing American outposts along the main roads. Musket fire crackled through the humid air as colonial sentries fell back toward their main positions. Each skirmish brought the same ominous news. The British were advancing in overwhelming numbers along multiple axes. By afternoon, the full scope of Howe's plan began to emerge. This would not be a simple frontal assault against prepared positions. The British commander intended to demonstrate against the American center, a left, while secretly massing his main force for a devastating flanking movement through the Jamaica Pass. It was a classic example of 18th century European warfare, elegant, methodical, and potentially decisive. The pre-dawn darkness of August 27, 1776, concealed one of the most audacious military maneuvers of the Revolutionary War. While American sentries strained their eyes toward the obvious approaches along the Flatbush and Bedford roads, 10,000 British and Hessian troops were executing a 15-mile night march through the Jamaica Pass, completely undefended save for a handful of militia officers who were quickly overwhelmed and captured. General Henry Clinton, the architect of this flanking movement, had spent days reconnoitering the American positions. His intelligence network, composed of local loyalists and British agents, had identified the fatal gap in Washington's defensive scheme. The Jamaica Pass, winding through the heights of Guam far to the east, offered a perfect route to strike. The American rear. By dawn, Clinton's column would be positioned to roll up the entire rebel line. Lieutenant Colonel James Grant commanded the British demonstration along the Gowanus Road, his Scottish Highlanders and light infantry keeping up a steady harassing fire against Lord Stirling's positions. The sound of bagpipes drifted across the marshy ground as the kilted soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. For the Americans crouched behind hastily constructed breastworks, the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Meanwhile, along the Bedford Road, Hessian General Leopold Philipp D. Heister's blue-coated mercenaries pressed forward with characteristic Prussian discipline. These were professional soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, their movements precise and coordinated, unlike the Americans, who fought as individuals. The Hessians operated as a single, deadly organism. Their brass-fronted miter caps and perfectly maintained muskets spoke of years of drill and battlefield experience. The first hint of disaster came around 9 o'clock in the morning, when American pickets on the eastern flank reported the sound of drums and fifes approaching from an impossible direction. General Sullivan, commanding the left wing, initially dismissed these reports as confused accounts of the main British advance. The idea that enemy forces could have penetrated so far behind American lines seemed inconceivable. Captain Udney Hay of the Pennsylvania Associators was among the first to see the full horror of their situation. From his position on a small rise, he watched in growing alarm as column after column of redcoats emerged from the woods to the east, their regimental colors unfurling in the morning breeze. The trap had not merely been set, it had snapped, shut with devastating precision. "My God," Hay whispered to his sergeant, "we're surrounded." The panic began slowly, spreading through the American ranks like wildfire through dry timber. Men who had stood firm against frontal attacks now found themselves caught between advancing enemies. The careful defensive positions that had seemed so strong moments before became death traps, with British forces attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. General Sullivan attempted to reform his scattered units, riding frantically between positions while shouting orders above the growing din of battle. His horse, a bay mare named Duchess, had been with him since the siege of Boston, but now she pranced nervously as musket balls whistled past. Sullivan's uniform, once immaculate blue and buff, was already stained with powder smoke and the sweat of desperate exertion. The collapse of the American left was swift and complete. Continental soldiers, many fighting their first major engagement, found themselves outflanked and outnumbered. Some units attempted to maintain formation while falling back, but cohesion quickly broke down as British cavalry appeared on their flanks. The morning that had begun with such hope was turning into a nightmare of military disaster. Lord Stirling's Maryland and Delaware troops on the American right initially held their ground with remarkable tenacity. These were some of Washington's best soldiers, men who had volunteered for extended service and received more training than typical militia units. They poured disciplined volleys into Grant's advancing Highlanders, temporarily halting the British advance along the Gowanus Road, but even Stirling's veterans could not hold indefinitely against superior numbers, attacking from multiple directions. As word spread of Sullivan's collapse, units began looking over their shoulders for escape routes. The stone house that served as Stirling's headquarters became a rallying point for desperate men seeking leadership in chaos. The sound of battle had become a continuous roar, musket fire, artillery, the screams of wounded men and horses, and above it all, the steady beat of British drums maintaining the rhythm of advance. Smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, obscuring vision and adding to the confusion. In this hellish landscape, individual acts of heroism and cowardice played out in quick succession, each man facing the ultimate test of his character. The Gowanus Creek, normally a peaceful waterway meandering through Brooklyn's marshlands, had become a barrier between life and death for hundreds of American soldiers. Lord Stirling, his blue coat torn and powder-stained, stood on a small hillock overlooking the creek, watching his Maryland and Delaware regiments make their desperate stand against overwhelming odds. The water below ran red with blood, earning it the grim nickname that would echo through history, the River of Death. Major Mordecai Gist of the 1st Maryland Regiment embodied the fierce determination of these Continental soldiers. His men, mostly recruited from Baltimore and the surrounding counties, had trained for months under his exacting standards. Now, as British forces closed in from three sides, Gist deployed his 430 men in a thin line along the WWII house, a stone farmhouse that commanded the approaches to the creek. The British forces advancing against them were formidable, grand Scottish Highlanders, their tartan kilts swirling as they charged, supported by English grenadiers whose towering mitre caps made them appear even more imposing. Behind them came the deadly accurate fire of British light infantry. Their shorter muskets, allowing for rapid reloading and precise shooting, formed squares. Stirling's voice carried across the battlefield as British cavalry appeared on the flanks. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, known as the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, had brought their mounted arm forward to exploit the American confusion. Sabres flashed in the morning sun as horsemen prepared to charge the increasingly desperate colonial formations. Captain John Eager Howard of the Maryland Line would later describe the scene in his memoirs as the most sublime and terrible spectacle I have ever witnessed. His company, positioned behind a low stone wall, maintained disciplined fire even as comrades fell around them. The young captain, barely 24 years old, moved among his men with steady calm, encouraging them by example rather than exhortation. The WWII house became the focal point of the most desperate fighting. Built of local stone with thick walls, it offered the Americans a strong defensive position from which to contest the British advance. Musket fire erupted from every window as Maryland soldiers turned the humble farmhouse into a fortress. Outside, British soldiers sought cover behind barns and outbuildings, their redcoats making them easy targets for American marksmen. Stirling himself seemed to be everywhere at once, his sword flashing as he led counterattacks against British positions. The 46-year-old general, despite his aristocratic pretensions and questionable claim to a Scottish title, proved himself a warrior of the first order. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, carried him through the thickest fighting as he rallied his crumbling line. The situation grew increasingly desperate as more British units arrived. The 42nd Regiment of Foot, the famous Black Watch, deployed their Highland broadswords alongside their muskets, creating a terrifying spectacle of disciplined violence. There were cries in Gaelic added to the chaos as they charged American positions with cold steel. Yet among the Maryland troops, extraordinary acts of individual heroism emerged from the carnage. Sergeant William Brown, a former blacksmith from Annapolis, single-handedly held a breach in the stone wall for nearly an hour, his musket empty but his bayonet bloody. When British soldiers finally overwhelmed his position, they found him still standing, surrounded by enemy dead. The Delaware Regiment, under Colonel John Haslett, fought with equal distinction on the American left. These men, many of them farmers and tradesmen from the counties along Delaware Bay, had never imagined they would die so far from home. Yet they stood firm in the face of professional European soldiers, their hunting shirts and broadbrimmed hats marking them as distinctly American warriors. Private Joseph Plum Martin of the Connecticut Line, though serving with a different unit, captured the essence of the fighting in his later writings. The enemy advanced and we retreated. Then we advanced and they retreated. All the while the air was filled with lead and iron, and the ground beneath was shook with the thunder of cannon. His account, referenced in numerous Revolutionary War histories, provides an enlisted man's perspective on the desperate struggle. As the afternoon wore on, ammunition began to run short among the American defenders. Men searched the bodies of fallen comrades for cartridges, their hands shaking as they loaded unfamiliar muskets picked up from the battlefield. The acrid smell of gunpowder, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and the sickly sweet odor of death that would haunt survivors for years to come. Stirling knew his position was hopeless, but military honor demanded one final gesture. Gathering the remnants of the Maryland and Delaware regiments, perhaps 250 men still capable of fighting, he prepared for a charge that would either break through to safety or end in glorious annihilation. The stone walls of the WWII house, scarred by musket balls and cannon fire, would witness one of the most desperate and heroic actions in American military history. Washington stood on Brooklyn Heights, his spyglass trembling in his hands as he watched the systematic destruction of his army in the valley below. The morning's confident defensive positions had collapsed into a chaotic rout, with British forces rolling up his flanks like a carpet. Through the smoke and confusion of battle, he could see Lord Stirling's tiny force making their desperate stand at the Gowanus Creek, hopelessly outnumbered but refusing to yield. The enormity of the disaster was becoming clear. Of the approximately 4,000 men he had deployed forward of the main fortifications, perhaps half were dead, wounded, or captured, General Sullivan was already a prisoner, taken when his position collapsed under the British flanking attack. The cream of the Continental Army, the Maryland and Delaware regiments that had performed so magnificently in training, was being systematically annihilated in the killing fields below. Adjutant General Joseph Reed, Washington's most trusted advisor, approached with a face ashen from the reports flooding in from across the battlefield. "Sir, we're receiving requests from multiple commanders for permission to withdraw. The outer defenses cannot hold." Washington's jaw clenched as he considered the options. None of them good. A general retreat in daylight, under enemy observation, would invite catastrophe. British cavalry would cut down fleeing soldiers like wheat before a scythe. Yet to remain in position meant accepting the gradual destruction of everything they had built. Since the siege of Boston, below them, Lord Stirling was making his final charge. The remnants of the Maryland and Delaware regiments formed into a tight column, erupted from behind the stone walls of the WWII house like a thunderbolt. Their bayonets glinted in the afternoon sun as they smashed into the surprised British line, seeking to carve a path through to safety. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the impossible might occur. The Maryland men, fighting with the fury of cornered lions, actually drove back the British advance guard. Lord Stirling himself, sword raised high, led the charge on his magnificent chestnut horse. His voice, trained in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh and New York, now roared commands across the battlefield with the authority of absolute desperation. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. Fresh British reserves, the 44th Regiment of Foot, moved up to seal the breach. The Maryland men, exhausted from hours of fighting, found their charge faltering against disciplined volleys from professional soldiers. One by one, the brave colonials fell, their blood mixing with the muddy waters of the Gowanus Creek. Major Gist, his sword broken and his uniform in tatters, continued fighting with a musket taken from a fallen British soldier. Around him, the survivors of his once proud battalion clustered in an ever-shrinking circle, their ammunition nearly exhausted. The scene reminded witnesses of ancient Sparta, where 300 warriors had died rather than surrender their position. Washington, watching this tragedy unfold, allegedly uttered the words that would echo through American military history: "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." His aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, stood beside him in stunned silence. The young man's usual eloquence failed him in the face of such heroic sacrifice. The British, for their part, showed professional respect for their opponent's courage. General Grant, commanding the Scottish troops, later wrote in his dispatch to London, "The rebel Americans, though lacking in discipline and equipment, displayed a ferocity in combat that surprised even veteran officers of His Majesty's service." Such acknowledgment from an enemy general spoke volumes about the quality of resistance the colonials had offered. As evening approached, the tactical situation became clear to all participants. The British controlled the field, having inflicted devastating casualties on the American forces. Conservative estimates suggested that Washington had lost nearly 2,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured out of his original force of 8,000. More critically, many of his best officers and most experienced soldiers were among the casualties. Yet General Howe, despite his overwhelming victory, made a crucial decision that would alter the course of the war. Rather than pressing his advantage with an immediate assault on the Brooklyn Heights fortifications, he ordered his troops to begin siege operations. The British commander, perhaps mindful of the costly lessons learned at Bunker Hill, chose methodical approach over bold action. This decision gave Washington the precious hours he needed to contemplate his next move. The American position on Brooklyn Heights, while strong, was essentially a trap. With the British controlling the surrounding area and the Royal Navy dominating the harbor approaches, his army faced potential annihilation if it remained in place. A retreat across the East River under enemy observation seemed equally impossible. As darkness fell over the battlefield, both armies settled into their positions for what many believed would be the final act of the American Revolution. British campfires twinkled in the darkness like fallen stars, while American sentries paced nervously behind their earthworks, starting at every sound. The fate of the rebellion hung in the balance, dependent on decisions that would be made in the darkest hours before dawn. The evening of August 27th brought an eerie calm to the battlefield as both armies settled into their positions. British campfires dotted the landscape like a constellation of conquest, while American defenders huddled behind their earthworks on Brooklyn Heights, nursing wounds and contemplating their desperate situation. General Washington paced the ramparts of Fort Putnam, his mind racing through increasingly desperate scenarios for salvation. The American position had become untenable, with British forces controlling the countryside and Admiral Howe's fleet commanding the waters around Manhattan. The Continental Army was trapped like a wolf in a snare. Every hour brought fresh intelligence of British preparations for a formal siege. Artillery was being brought forward, trenches were being dug in the approved European manner, and more troops continued to disembark from the seemingly endless fleet in the harbor. Colonel John Glover of the 14th Massachusetts Regiment presented himself at Washington's headquarters as the night deepened. The weathered mariner from Marblehead brought with him a proposal that seemed to border on madness. A nighttime evacuation across the East River using every available boat in the area. Glover's men, fishermen and sailors by trade, possessed the nautical skills necessary for such an operation, but the risks were enormous. Sir, Glover's Massachusetts accent carried the authority of a man who had spent his life battling the North Atlantic. My boys know these waters. We can get the army across, but it must be done in darkness, and we'll need every craft from here to Hellgate. The evacuation plan that emerged from the midnight councils of war was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Every boat, barge, and sailing vessel within reach would be commandeered for the operation. The wounded would go first, followed by the artillery and supplies, with the infantry forming a rear guard to maintain the illusion of continued occupation until the final moment. Throughout the night of August 28th, preparations proceeded with desperate efficiency. Muffled commands echoed through the American camps as units were quietly briefed on their roles in the withdrawal. Wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth to reduce noise, and strict orders were given that no fires should be lit and no loud talking permitted. The slightest sound might alert British sentries to the massive movement. Beginning behind American lines, the weather, which had been clear and hot throughout the battle, began to change as the evacuation commenced. A northeast wind sprang up, bringing with it banks of fog that rolled across the East River like a blessing from Providence itself. The mist, so thick that visibility dropped to mere yards, provided the perfect concealment for the desperate American. Gamble Dock Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as one of Washington's aides de camp, would later write of the night, "Never did Providence more visibly interfere in the affairs of men than in the fog which concealed our retreat." The young officer, barely 21 years old, supervised the loading of artillery pieces on flatboats, his usual intellectual precision channeled into the minutiae of military logistics. The evacuation proceeded with remarkable discipline. Considering the circumstances, regiment after regiment slipped away from their positions, leaving behind carefully arranged campfires and sentries, who would maintain the illusion of normal activity until the last possible moment. The Marblehead fishermen worked their boats with the skill of generations, ferrying load after load across the dark waters, while British sentries remained oblivious to the movement. General Israel Putnam, the grizzled Connecticut veteran, supervised the withdrawal of the last infantry units. At 68 years old, Old Put had seen service in 3 wars, but nothing had prepared him for the psychological strain of abandoning a position under enemy observation. His hand shook slightly as he consulted his pocket watch. Dawn was approaching, and thousands of men remained to be evacuated. The most dangerous moment came as the eastern sky began to lighten. British sentries, making their routine morning rounds, began to notice inconsistencies in the American positions. Campfires that should have been tended burned down to embers, and the normal sounds of an army stirring to life were mysteriously absent. Alert British officers began to suspect that something extraordinary was occurring. Private David Howe of the Massachusetts line captured the tension of those final hours in his diary. "The fog lay so thick upon the ground that we could not see a man at 6 yards distance. The boats came and went all night like ghosts upon the water, and we knew not whether we should see another sunrise as free men." Washington himself remained on Brooklyn Heights until the very last boat, refusing to abandon his post while a single soldier remained in danger. As the fog began to lift with the approaching dawn, he could see British patrols moving closer to the American lines. The race between evacuation and discovery had become a matter of minutes rather than hours. The final boatload carried Washington and his remaining staff officers across the East River, just as British troops stormed the abandoned American fortifications. From the Manhattan side, the general could see redcoats swarming over the earthworks his men had defended so desperately. Just hours before, the sight filled him with both relief at their escape and profound sorrow for the brave men who would never see home again. The morning of August 30th, 1776, dawned clear and bright over Manhattan Island, revealing the full scope of what many contemporaries would call the miracle of Brooklyn Heights. 9,000 American soldiers, along with their artillery, supplies, and wounded comrades, had vanished from under the noses of the most powerful military force on earth. General Howe's carefully planned siege had been rendered meaningless by a single night of desperate seamanship and divine intervention. In the British camp, the discovery of the American evacuation sparked a mixture of admiration and frustration. Among the officer corps, General Henry Clinton, architect of the successful flanking movement, surveyed the abandoned American positions with professional interest. The earthworks showed signs of hasty abandonment, equipment scattered about, campfires still smoldering, and personal effects left behind by soldiers who had prioritized speed over possessions. Remarkable, Clinton muttered to his aide, examining the Continental Army manual left behind in one of the huts. To execute such a withdrawal under our very noses requires either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck. He would later write in his memoirs that the American evacuation ranked among the finest military movements he had witnessed in 30 years of service. The human cost of the Battle of Long Island was staggering for the Americans. Official casualty reports, compiled weeks later, showed nearly 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured out of Washington's original force of 8,000. The Maryland and Delaware regiments, which had fought so magnificently at the Gowanus Creek, were virtually annihilated. Of major gist for 130 Maryland men, fewer than a dozen answered the next morning's roll call. Among the captured was General John Sullivan, taken prisoner during the collapse of the American left wing. The New Hampshire politician turned soldier would spend the next several weeks in British custody, during which time he would be approached by Admiral Howe with informal peace overtures. Sullivan's eventual release and return to American lines would carry with him the first serious British attempt at negotiated settlement since the war began. The strategic consequences of the defeat extended far beyond mere casualties. Washington's army, though preserved by the miraculous evacuation, had been bloodied and demoralized by their first encounter with professional European forces. Many Continental soldiers, having witnessed the disciplined efficiency of British and Hessian troops, began to question whether colonial forces could ever match their opponents in conventional warfare. More immediately, the loss of Long Island exposed Manhattan Island to British attack from multiple directions. The Hudson River approaches, which Washington had hoped to control, were now dominated by British forces. Admiral Howe's fleet could move freely through the harbor, threatening American positions from the water, while General Howe's army prepared to assault from the land. The psychological impact on American morale was equally severe. News of the defeat spread rapidly through the colonies, carried by survivors who painted grim pictures of British military superiority. Recruitment for the Continental Army, already difficult, became nearly impossible in some areas as potential volunteers reconsidered the wisdom of opposing the Crown's professional forces. Yet the evacuation itself began to take on mythical proportions. In American memory, stories of the fog, the silent boats, and Washington's stoic courage spread through the colonies like wildfire. What had begun as a military disaster was transformed into a tale of divine providence and American ingenuity. The very fact that the Army had survived to fight another day became a source of inspiration for the broader revolutionary cause. In the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, the news of Long Island sparked intense debate about the future conduct of the war. Some delegates, led by John Dickens of Pennsylvania, began to advocate for renewed attempts at reconciliation with Britain. The overwhelming British victory seemed to prove that military resistance was futile against such superior forces. However, others, including John Adams of Massachusetts and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, argued that the evacuation demonstrated American resilience and resourcefulness. "We may lose battles," Adams declared to the Congress, "but we shall not lose the war so long as our army survive to fight again." This perspective would prove prophetic in the months and years to come. As referenced in Ron Cherno's comprehensive biography of Washington, the commander-in-chief himself underwent a profound transformation during and after the Battle of Long Island. the Virginia planter, who had accepted command of the Continental Army with some reluctance, now understood the full weight of his responsibilities. The survival of the American cause rested entirely on his shoulders and the shoulders of the men who had chosen to follow him. The British, despite their tactical victory, had failed to achieve their strategic objective of destroying the Continental Army. General Howe's decision to conduct a formal siege rather than an immediate assault had given Washington the precious hours needed for evacuation. This pattern, British tactical success coupled with strategic failure, would characterize much of the war that followed. The weeks following the Battle of Long Island saw a fundamental transformation in the character of the American Revolution. What had begun as a conflict over taxation and representation had evolved into a brutal struggle for national survival. The myth of colonial military superiority, born from romanticized accounts of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, lay shattered among the corpses floating in the Gowanus Creek. General Washington, established a new headquarters on Manhattan Island, spent countless hours analyzing the lessons of the defeat. His correspondence during this period reveals a man grappling with the harsh realities of commanding amateur soldiers against professional armies. The enemy's discipline, and our want of it, he wrote to his brother John Augustine, was never more conspicuous than in this action. The surviving officers of the Maryland and Delaware regiments became the nucleus of a new military philosophy. Major Mordecai Gist, one of the few field officers to escape the carnage at the Vet Cortelyou House, was promoted to colonel and tasked with training replacements. His methods, informed by bitter experience, emphasized small unit tactics, individual marksmanship, and the kind of flexible fighting that colonial forces could execute better than their European opponents. Captain John Eager Howard, whose company had held the stone wall with such distinction, became an advocate for light infantry tactics adapted to American conditions. His training manual, circulated throughout the Continental Army, stressed the importance of terrain, cover, and rapid movement over the rigid linear formations that had proven so costly on Long Island. The British, for their part, began to understand that conquering territory was vastly different from controlling it. General Howe found himself master of New York Harbor and western Long Island, but the countryside remained hostile. Local militia units, inspired by stories of Maryland heroism, began a campaign of harassment that would plague British operations. For the remainder of the war, the strategic implications of the battle extended beyond immediate military concerns. European observers, particularly in France, watched the conflict with growing interest. The American ability to preserve their army despite overwhelming defeat suggested a resilience that might warrant foreign support. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes began the first tentative steps toward what would eventually become the Franco-American alliance. The human stories emerging from the battle took on lives of their own in American memory. Tales of Lord Stirling's final charge, of Maryland men dying rather than surrendering, and of Washington's narrow escape spread through the colonies like scripture. These stories, embellished with each telling, created a mythology of sacrifice and heroism that would sustain the revolutionary cause through darker days ahead. Private Joseph Plum Martin, whose service extended far beyond Long Island, would later write, "We learned that day that courage alone was not enough to win battles, but we also learned that with courage, even the worst defeats could be survived." His memoir, published decades later, captured the transformation of the Continental Army from an idealistic militia into a professional fighting force. The medical consequences of the battle led to significant improvements in Army medical care. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the Continental Army Surgeon General, instituted new procedures for treating battlefield wounds based on observations from Long Island. The primitive field hospitals established during the evacuation became the foundation for a more systematic approach to military medicine. The evacuation itself entered American folklore as an example of divine providence. Protecting the righteous cause, Reverend Alexander McWhorter, chaplain of the New York regiments, preached sermons throughout the colonies describing the fog as a manifestation of God's favor toward American independence. Such religious interpretations helped maintain morale during the dark months that followed. In the British camp, the victory was celebrated with appropriate ceremony, but thoughtful officers recognized that a decisive campaign had become a protracted war. Captain John Montreser of the Royal Engineers wrote in his journal, "We have won the field, but lost the initiative. The rebels' escape has prolonged this business indefinitely." The Battle of Long Island thus became a paradox, a devastating defeat that ultimately strengthened the American cause. The survival of Washington's army, achieved through desperate measures and favorable circumstances, demonstrated that the rebellion could endure even catastrophic setbacks. The courage displayed by units like the Maryland Line created a standard of sacrifice that inspired future generations of American soldiers. As autumn approached in 1776, both armies prepared for continued conflict. The British, confident in their tactical superiority, planned campaigns to crush the rebellion through conventional warfare. The Americans, chastened by defeat but not broken, began the long process of learning how to fight a war of survival against a superior enemy. The echoes of that August battle would resonate throughout the war and beyond. When American forces finally achieved victory at Yorktown 5 years later, veterans of Long Island stood in the ranks, their understanding of warfare tempered by the bitter lessons learned in Brooklyn's fields. The revolution that nearly ended in the killing fields of Long Island had instead been transformed into something more durable and more dangerous to British hopes than any conventional military victory could have been. The Battle of Long Island, in all its tragedy and triumph, had forged the character of American arms in the crucible of defeat and demonstrated that sometimes the most profound victories emerge from the ashes of apparent disaster.